Okay. So, as you know, Wendell started our series on the Pentateuch, going over, well, I'll get ahead of myself here, okay? He was framing it as how we presented decision-making in the will of God, and where we wrestle over a substantial topic over many Sundays. We have various speakers come and make a contribution towards what you might call a larger body of work. And in that case, much of the material was taken from Greg Kokel's work on the subject, but not all of it. So for us, one of the main texts we'll be using is Interpreting the Pentateuch by Peter Vogt and some others. I don't really have them all listed up here, but I think that does really provide a good context for the way we're going to approach the subject, the format, and then depth that we'll go to, or what you can expect. But I wanted to add a few of my own comments before I got started on my part. So a main goal at Tech has always been to make significant contributions to our understanding, or the people that attend here, to our understanding of the biblical faith, and therefore ultimately to our worldview. So that means we need to be able to teach from the Bible and about the Bible well enough and deep enough and thorough enough to understand how and why we ought to it ought to affect the way we think, or the way we behave, or the way we act professionally, how we raise our families, even the plans we make for the future, however tenuous those might be. And I know that's been true for me personally, time and again, where the instruction offered here not just illuminates a topic so that I understand it more fully, but often the ideas I learn sometimes run counter to those that I've learned before, or perhaps I've just bumped into and picked up on accident along the way. So beyond learning more, or quantitatively more, or qualitatively something different, the best learning I think a teacher can do is hand down to his or her students the principles that govern what's going on, that come together to make up the whole so that you understand it even better, not so much on the surface. So this is what Wendell was referring to when he was talking about creating a paradigm by which we can filter new ideas or old ideas through. He mentioned this in his first sermon relating to how the laws would relate to the new covenant. So if that doesn't ring a bell, that would be probably worth going back and listening to. And the power behind teaching this way is that instead of, say, in a conversation or with yourself or whatever the case may be, you don't have to stick to memorized talking points, but you understand the bigger picture. It enables a person to carry on a more dynamic conversation with somebody, so that even if a twist comes up, you can adapt and you're not completely clueless as to what's going on, even though there may need to be some follow-up work, some homework and some more reading to do after the fact. So our approach to a series like this is different than the typical standalone sermon, where you walk away with perhaps a handful of points that you remember for a couple of days, and it's perfectly good information, but it can't offer the same kind of contribution to your broader understanding of the Christian life. So as excellent and well delivered as many of the sermons we have here are. So I want to give Guy Platter props for encouraging us as leaders to come up with sort of the next big thing to address, which in this case happens to be the Pentateuch. So if you don't like it, that also means you can complain to him, which is great. So I did want to list a couple of what I think are sort of indispensable topics, because enough time has gone on in our church. I kind of forget how many people are new here, or people that are young adults were just born, or not even in existence when I started here, or whatever the case may be. I know the first thing I learned about when I came to what was Church of the Lamb was the need was impressed upon me to have reasons to understand or give a defense why somebody would believe in the resurrection. That had never been asked of me before. So you can think of 1 Peter 3:15, right, being able to give a defense. I had been exposed to none of the material that I can recall, and if there's something you need to understand about Christianity, that would be a pretty big one. And this was kind of made me angry. It kind of troubled me. It was a real wake-up call. If I had so ineffectively questioned my faith before, and been so poorly prepared to do so by the churches I had attended, what else had I left unchecked or unchallenged? Another one would be the idea of sin, that we are not good people in need of a little bit of help. I still cringe when I hear somebody say, oh, he's a good person. I just want to say, well, no, he's not, but which I started doing with my kids. I'm like, that's not a good thing to say to your kids. You have to meet your audience. Like later say, well, when I said you were a good kid, here's what I meant by that. You're kind of good. Work is a great one. I remember Michael and Wendell and Sean talking frequently about work as a good thing, and that surprised me, and something that we're actually made for, and why Christians should be the best employees of all. And not only that, but we'll be working on indefinitely to infinity, which blew my mind that would be something we would actually want. I remember a girl in class once having a meltdown when she realized she'd be spending the rest of her life working. It hadn't occurred to her at that point that would happen, and she was despondent. It was great, because it has to occur to you sometime. More recently, of course, we're familiar with the pressure put on these foundational issues, sanctity of life and marriage, in our current social climate, and so the need we feel to regularly and boldly address these issues, or whatever the latest assault might be. You could think of Seth's most recent sermon as sort of a collection, or as adding to the collection of sermons that we've had that's been spread out over, of course, years and years and years. Big one that I already mentioned as far as the format, but the content behind decision-making in the will of God is, I think, such an important contribution to a proper understanding of exercising the wisdom that the Lord gives us and is still willing to give us if we ask for it, as it says in James, most notably, of course, through his word. And any discussion I've found of the will of God needs to be carefully articulated, defining your terms, and there's a tendency to give these glib Christianese answers to what really end up being hard questions. So that's, I think, foundational. Platonism was a topic. There's one of my first awful sermons I gave was on Platonism, but it's a great topic to dive into because it affects things like decision making and the way we perceive so many things, and not just the physical realm is not a bad thing inherently, but how much Platonic thought has worked its way into the Christian church, and Christian thinking and writing over the years is still, it's amazing how much we still run into that today, or I do. How we treat alcohol and communion. This is sounds pretty specific, but it's actually kind of an amazing topic because, again, this relates to how we treat the physical world. It can be a hot button issue. But again, being able to go and think biblically about things aside from how you happen to feel about them or how you were raised was actually very, very enlightening to me. Church discipline. We have spent no small amount of time on this, and it's still a little disappointing or intriguing to see how sheepish so many churches are when it comes to the mandates of Matthew 18. So that's obviously something else I appreciate. And I could go on. Some other sermon series that are a big deal would, of course, be the atonement, the Trinity, women in ministry. We've spent a lot of time on divorce and remarriage, and just things that change the way you actually think, not just about these things when you're reading your Bible, but how you actually conduct your everyday life. I wouldn't want to leave out these other sermon series that Wendell's had ongoing for some time. The Accompanying Children at the Deli Table series and the Evils of Hallway Loitering. It's not the longest sermons, but it's been going on the longest, so it's more of a frequency thing. Anyway, so all this material, of course, has been supported by outstanding thinkers and authors. We're very careful about that. The commonly occurring names of men and women, philosophers, theologians, apologists, researchers, quoted from this pulpit that I'm not at right now, is very substantial, very impressive. I won't even bother to attempt to name any, but I will go out of my way to repeat and underscore that, of course, none of them replace Scripture, and we are firmly and highly aware of that. We have become familiar with quality publishers, which is something that gets overlooked a lot, especially in a day and age where just about anything can get published. And we've had many of those speakers here, which is great. Somebody might ask, though, why do you guys talk about those things? It sounds more like a class or a course than a sermon series. You know, what is the benefit of having learning that come across so academic rather than giving your congregation a pep talk every week? What would you say to that? Well, aside from the fact that learning truth and insight ought to be stimulating and important and exciting and motivational all by itself, I think, there's a very simple reason, and that is we cannot live out the Christian faith properly if we don't understand it. That is simply common sense. That is, of course, assuming there is such a thing as truth and we can actually study the Bible in a meaningful way, which is obviously something we believe. So it doesn't necessarily follow that when we learn something, that means we're right about it. Of course, certainly that's true, but at very least we know why we think about or believe a certain way, and hopefully we're always open to rethink our position when new information comes along, because it will. Perhaps this will serve as an encouragement for some of you to check out the series if you're not familiar with them. Now, I'm not sure what of that information is available versus, the internet versus we did CDs and we have cassettes laying around and some are just lost forever. This is where I would insert a joke about ask Denny. He probably has the transcript memorized. You could just ask him and he'll give you the rundown. My goal here, by the way, is to never become one of those guys. You know how we tease Wendell a lot about being cranky, or Tim has his own skill set. My goal is just to blend in and never be that guy on anything, and just be in that sweet spot of slightly above average, but always blending in the background. So if you can honor that, I'd really appreciate that. So in our current series on the Pentateuch, which is what I'm getting at, we're diving into a larger body of material that would fit in with this series that we have in mind. And the Old Testament, of course, is often underdeveloped and overlooked, but offers, we are convinced, a very significant contribution to the understanding of the God of Christianity, because after all, he is the same as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And by the way, just that is one underlying assumption, as Wendell addressed. If you go back to Marcion and other people that have been around, haven't always been that way. We may assume that, but it is not necessarily the truth. Where he had concluded the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament were different, it occurred to me this week that it really wasn't far. One of the things I was reading about him, he used some of the same words that Richard Dawkins used, which is interesting, who would disparage the God of the Old Testament as jealous, malicious, bungling, and genocidal, which is a great example of the extreme fallout of what happens when we hold our own convictions closer to that than what we find in Scripture. Marcion didn't even fully deny the deity of the God of the Old Testament, but considered him more of a secondary deity to the supreme God revealed in Jesus. But then, of course, he had to go through the Old Testament and take a scalpel to it and either edit things or remove parts of it altogether, because that's what you have to do to hold a belief system like he had. So he did not have very good hermeneutic or apologetic training, apparently. So for the two sermons I'll be presenting, we're going to move forward with the types of after the types of genres, which is what Wendell covered, which were what, by the way? He said the Old Testament and the Pentateuch is basically what two genres? Law and narrative, right. And so he spent one Sunday on each of those. Ultimately, and then he had this diagram, which I think is very helpful, the individual laws we might find in the Pentateuch and elsewhere, but pretty much there, the deeper principles, as far as that's how we need to be looking at it now, that are all based in the nature and character of God. And I found that very, very helpful to understand how we ought to think of these things. And of course, the Sermon on the Mount is a great example for that. Then, of course, he went over Old Testament narrative, the purposeful retelling of historical events, and not just looking, and he had this outline as well that I think I had reviewed at the close of the sermon, not simply viewing an event in its immediate context or even to just Israelite history, but being able to understand it in the broader framework. And I thought we could take kind of his picture and think of it inverted in a sense. Like you have redemption history, Israelite history, of course, would be a subset of that, and then each of the event narratives are part of that. But of course, not losing the perspective that it all ties in a deliberate fashion to redemption history. So as we move on to major themes covered in the Pentateuch, there will be many times I'll want to refer to a bunch of events as I was compiling it throughout the 5 books. I couldn't help but feel this was going to be horribly disjointed if we didn't do a brief overview for a much more effective reference later, which is what we'll be doing this morning. So an ideal scenario is to have everyone read Genesis through Deuteronomy And it just so happens that there's no reading for the theology study this week. So that's just a perfect opportunity to do that if you haven't either ever done it or if you have not done it in a long time. Even the overview that I'll do this morning, of course, doesn't do it justice. Even taking notes when you get to some of the more confusing parts, I'm sure would be beneficial. Oh, I'm not there yet. So basically, my goal is this morning to do just sort of what people call like a 10,000-foot flyover, or in the office you call it a rundown, or, just want to go through the basic highlights of what is in here. I don't know if the average person, if you ask them what's the difference between Leviticus and Numbers, I don't know who can give a cogent answer to that and who can't. I don't have any idea. So I'm assuming not everybody can. So that will be the idea, to provide context of the whole, if that makes sense. And then when we get into the major themes, they will make, I think, so much more sense. I did not ask permission to do this. Sorry, Wendell. But in my defense, I'd say I learned this tactic from Wendell to do a setup sermon. Feels a little like a tease, like this wasn't what I showed up to hear. But I guess you'll have to show up next week. I don't know. And I think this will free up. We have speakers going over the individual books later, and to cover a whole book in the New Testament in 1 week, of course, is a very difficult thing to do. So hopefully the additional goal would be to free up their time, and then they can have a little bit more leeway about what they want to talk about. So, and honestly, some of the material in the Pentateuch, as I was rereading it, is hard for us to relate to. There's just really no way around. So I would encourage that you keep this in mind. Read this word for word, okay? We'll be studying the account of a Near Eastern culture, okay, with explicit intervention and interaction by God, which is a big deal, and it's removed from us time-wise twice the amount of that of the New Testament, which is already a considerable gap of time, okay? Like, you could just imagine the difference in American culture between now and the 1950s, and it's almost unrecognizable. And then now we're talking about thousands and thousands of years, geographical distance, an Eastern versus a Western culture. And there's just a lot that goes into it, on top of God deliberately intervening in ways that we have recorded. So I thought this would be a good sort of New Testament motivation to get into the Old Testament from Romans 9, where Paul's contextualizing the Jews as it refers to salvation history. I'll read a little bit before this. Paul writes, "I speak the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience confirms it through the Holy Spirit. I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption to sonship. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of the Messiah, who is God over all, forever praised. Amen." So it's a pretty powerful passage. If we were to limit our view of redemptive history and the restoration of God's people to the Old Testament time period, which is what I've got shown here, and considering the 5 books of the Pentateuch, it doesn't even take us quite up to the time where the Israelites occupied the land promised them through Abraham. So in the scheme of history, again, we're still talking about a fairly short time period. Starting at the beginning, I'd like to think that we're all pretty familiar with the book of Genesis. If we had to pick a book, that's the one we're going to be familiar with, right? So I'll say very little bit about it, except to point out some of the main themes and characters. So Genesis, as I know Wendell's talked about before, means beginnings or book of beginnings. We have all the stuff you'd expect to see. The creation shortly after the fall, Cain and Abel. These are all, of course, just the really significant things that happen to pop up. There's obviously a ton more that could be said. Noah and the flood. The Tower of Babel occurs shortly after that. And then as far as the Israelite nation is concerned, the significant event of God interacting with Abraham. We have Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then, of course, the descendants Isaac, Jacob and Esau, and then Joseph. And of course, Genesis closes with the Israelites moving into Egypt, which is significant. Of course, this is prior to the Exodus, and they numbered exactly 70. And later, when you see how many Israelites there are, we're still at a pretty small number at this point. And of course, they are well protected by Joseph's influence there in Egypt. followed by a short gap, and then Jacob's death, and of course, sometime after that, the death of Joseph. And Wendell made the point that when you read a narrative, obviously not everything could possibly be recorded, just the highlights of what the author thought was necessary to list. And again, like I said, my guess is we're very familiar with that, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on here. And there's nothing surprising as far as the narrative goes. There are multiple covenants. Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking the only covenant was made with Abraham, but there were covenants made to Noah and others that we could talk about. I think there might be an opportunity for Tim to talk about that at some point. I might be thinking of something else that he wrote. I don't know. Even early portions of the law are given. You can think about circumcision. So one of the themes that we'll see this morning is that, again, the law is given over time. The covenant and the law are not always one-time things, and that sometimes can get overlooked. So as we move into Exodus, my guess is we're pretty familiar with the content up through chapter 20, but I guess we'll see. We find that a new king has come to power in Egypt. He knows nothing about Joseph, and of course he's very concerned about the numbers that the Israelites have grown to, so they are not exactly in favor. This is where the birth of Moses comes up and what puts his life in danger, and of course Moses is presumably the author of the books of the Pentateuch. I'm not going to get into any of the weeds about whether or not that is, that's all I'm going to say about it. So he is, while Wendell said God, of course, is the main character in all this, Moses is definitely the second most important character in the sense that he is present in all the books except Genesis. So, of course, there's all this stuff that goes on. Moses is in Egypt, but then, of course, he ends up killing a man, so he has to flee Egypt. But eventually, the Lord calls him to return, confront Pharaoh, along with his brother Aaron, his older brother, older by 3 years. I always thought he was his brother-in-law. Am I crazy? I am crazy? Okay. No, I'm not. Okay. I don't know now. Okay. I might be. Carrie's probably right. Anyway, so, of course, the whole confrontation with the Pharaoh was inevitably led to the plagues, which, of course, and the Exodus after the final plague of the firstborn dying. So all this happens, they escape, and then they have the crossing of the sea, which is miraculous. And then I had to remember, and I'm like, how many times did the Lord part the waters at different points? Because I couldn't remember if it was 1 or 2 or 5. I knew it was multiple times. So I have to share this with you because it's so discouraging when you Google stuff. So the first thing I found when I Googled parting the waters, it was, of course, this. Not really. There's a scientific explanation, and you got these 63-mile-an-hour winds that run down and part the waters, and of course somehow the ground is dry. But it's not as bad as what the Christians tend to post, which is this one: 5 times God parts the waters, and how He will for you to. Oh yeah, I misread that. So that's way worse, right? Anyway, sorry, I shouldn't have shared that with you. So this is a good place. So right between the Exodus and the crossing of the sea, it's worth pointing out, and we'll get into some more of the nitty-gritty now, where Passover restrictions are given, the consecrating the firstborn, and this is still sort of a carryover from what happened in the last leg of the plague. That's still in God's mind, and He wants to impress it on His people. They're in the middle of the Exodus and crossing the sea, and He's not interested in them just fleeing, because of course He knows He has this all under control. He still wants to give them, this is important to Him, to give this part of the law to Him, to the Israelites at that time. So once the Israelites are safe from their enemies, they have other obstacles, namely, of course, food and water. And so the Lord supplies manna, quail, and water from a rock. Shortly after that, they are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and the 10 Commandments are being given in chapter 20. And my guess is we know all this. What I was less familiar basically with, as I assume most of us are, is sort of the material after this. Especially if it depends how often, of course, you've read through the Pentateuch, and it's been some years for me. So while the 10 Commandments are being given, and this is pretty fascinating, at that moment, the next 12 chapters all describes what God is saying to Moses as He's giving him the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments goes hand in hand with a huge, huge list of things. It wasn't like these things came later. These things came simultaneously. So in the list, I'm not going to bother reading all of these because there are so many. Well, I might just read them but not comment on them. Of course, if you look through this list and you end up with the tabernacle, a lot of what's going on here has to do with setting up the tabernacle so that God's presence can come to rest on them. And of course, if you don't understand that context, then the thing like the table and the lampstand, and whoever gets to cover Exodus might talk more about this. Those things don't make a lot of sense unless you understand how the tabernacle was supposed to be set up, and there's a lot of reading that you could do about that. But it's really interesting because early on, a lot of it isn't, we think of the law, again, sometimes as being a bit on the oppressive side, but there are just lots of real basic things that cover, again, necessary functioning of humans, such as cleanliness, personal injury, and how to mediate, as Wendell's talked about, mediate conflict, social responsibility, how we're supposed to treat each other. And so some of that is just very, very, very interesting to read. I know also when I was reading through this, thinking about the Ark of the Covenant and the table, the first thought was, I wonder who made that? Like, who is the guy or woman who is able to make this? And you can see in chapter 31, there are a couple specific men named and a whole group of people that he was specifically going to give the ability and the skill to create the thing. So he didn't say create this and then leave them stranded. He gave them the ability to actually make these things, which is awesome. One thing that gets often overlooked is there in chapter 23, which is called the angel of the Lord that dwelled with them apparently for some period of time, and it's not very clear how often. I'm going to read this excerpt from chapter 23. See, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I've prepared. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion, since my name is in him. If you listen carefully to what he says and do all that I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and will oppose those who oppose you. Then in chapter 4, and this is a fascinating passage I had actually forgotten about, Aaron and his two eldest sons, and you'll want to remember them because they don't last very long, and 70 of the elders of the Israelites are described in this majestic scene that actually sounds a lot like the transfiguration we read about in the New Testament. And so from chapter 24 of Exodus, it says, they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire or lapis lazuli. I don't know what that is. Apparently it's like sapphire. As bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites, even though they saw God and they ate and they drank. And so whoever gets to deal with the difficulties of this, that would be one of them. What does it mean to see God here and live, right? And then as we go down, the consecration of the priests, this would be Aaron, of course, and his sons. They're the first priests, and so Aaron, therefore, is the first high priest. Moving on then to the end, Sabbath laws. These are interesting because this is where it gets really interesting to read. For example, in verse 15 here of chapter 31, for 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. And that's pretty serious. It's probably hard to understand with modern ears how that is a reasonable thing to request. So what does Moses find when he comes down the mountain, right? And who did the sermon? I really enjoyed it, and then I forgot, on the golden calf. Was that you, Josh? You talked about the golden calf?
Maybe a little bit.
Maybe a little bit? Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to learn about what was probably going on in that context, but that's exactly what Moses found. Aaron was overseeing this all happening, worshiping the golden calf. And so it says, when Moses approached the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. His anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hand, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf, the people that they had made, and burned it in the fire. He ground it into powder, scattered it on the water, and then he made them drink it. So he was angry, apparently. We've all done that to our kids, right? So this is the most serious setback to Israel to date. Thousands are put to death as a result by their own leaders, and it's a very difficult passage. Additional rules are set as a reminder. Okay, I didn't have enough reminders. Apparently you need more, tassels and other things like that. But there is also a thing about themes I want to focus on is there are many things that are hard to read, but in every case there is a limiting of God's wrath. In this case, Moses pleads with God not to destroy the Israelites, not so much the other way around. He pleads to not destroy them for what they've done, and God actually gives him new tablets. So the consequence that goes on is very limited compared to what it could have been, and perhaps to what they deserved. And again, a lot of this ties in with our understanding of the seriousness of sin, right? In the balance of the book, we see Moses overseeing the carrying out of everything that had happened in chapters 20 to 32 on the Sermon on the Mount. That all had to be carried out. Just because God said it didn't mean it magically happened. The Israelites actually had to do it. And this finally culminates in the completion of the tabernacle, which is where God's presence descends in a cloud, and we read at the end, this is the very end of Exodus, then the cloud covering the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And as the cloud went on, then that's how they knew they were to move. The book of Leviticus, which means simply about the Levites, you can imagine then if you know anything about the Levites, this must have something to do with the law that's being given. But of course, it doesn't make sense to do a lot of things in Leviticus until the tabernacle is actually built. So sequentially, this has to make a lot more sense now. So of course, many of the offerings are mentioned here, burnt offerings, grain offerings. One of the more interesting one is the sin offerings, and most of the sin offerings are for sins that were unintentional, which again is something that we might miss over. We would just gloss over unintentional sins as though they weren't possibly quite as important, but there is quite a bit of ink devoted just to that idea. In chapter 8, Aaron and his sons are actually ordained as priests because they have a place to function as priests now. And then this is where his two oldest sons were consumed by apparently breaking the rules. The text says that they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord. It's not clear exactly what that means. But they were consumed and put to death, and Aaron did not say anything about it because apparently he knew better, which is amazing. We have regulations like cleanliness, childbirth, those relating to disease, mildew, the list goes on. And again, some of them have, as Wendell spoke, more of a moral overtone to them, and some of them are simply for the sake of their health, and sometimes it's really hard to separate those things. A very significant event comes up in chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. I mean, if you want to read about something that sounds exhausting, the Day of Atonement, like I remember I was reading it and I had forgotten this was like a once a year thing. That if they did this, this is all they would be doing with their lives forever, because there's so many things they have to do, or at least the priest has to do for them in this case, as far as offering up sins for his own self, for his family, for the Israelites, and the list goes on and on and on. Also here we have established the year of Jubilee, which Nate loves to talk about. So we have the Sabbath years. Every 7th year is a Sabbath year, and after 7 of those, the following, the 50th year, if you can do the multiplication there, is the year of Jubilee, which is a great positive thing for the Israelites and a reason to celebrate. In chapter 26, in case all of that wasn't clear enough, there's a whole list of punishments and rewards that God goes through to leave a distinct impression on them what to expect if they obey or if they don't. In chapter 27, the Lord says, Moses writes, these are the commands the Lord gave Moses at Mount Sinai for the Israelites. So that's pretty much Leviticus. The book of Numbers is named after 2 different census that took place as far as counting the people groups, where the first 10 chapters have to do with the year at Mount Sinai, at which point it says, on the 20th day of the 2nd month of the 2nd year, the cloud lifted above the tabernacle of the covenant of the law, and the Israelites set out from the desert of Sinai and traveled from place to place. Then they're all recorded in Numbers until the cloud came to rest in the desert of Paran, which is where this journey into Moab took considerable amount of time, apparently. So while there are lots of numbers in the book, it would be better to say it's much more about the people groups that make up the 12 tribes. And from these groups, one representative from each of the 12 tribes was finally chosen to explore Canaan. And this is, I think, probably one of the more helpful maps I found. So the Nile, obviously, that would be when the Israelites left Egypt, crossed the sea, went all the way down toward the peninsula there, and there is some discrepancy over where that is. But if we just go with this, spending some time there up to 2 years, and then finally trekking up through Canaan. And you can see there's a jog at the end, and that'll make more sense here in a minute. But right now, that little jog in, probably a little bit exaggerated, was when the 12 spies, as they're often called, with Caleb and Joshua, went in to explore the land, and then they came back. And then, of course, things didn't work out so well, as we'll talk about. And then you'll see what that last leg here means in just a minute. So the spies are sent into Canaan. I probably lost my place here. And probably, as you know, 10 of the 12 were faithless in the sense that they did not trust the Lord at all. They were scared out of their minds. They're like, we can't take the promised land. And therefore, that's when the ruling came down that whole generation would not be able to enter the promised land. And like after all this time, it's just crazy. So a major setback. But again, it was limited to one generation. Instead of the Lord giving up on them and walking away, they're like, okay, well, this generation, I'm not going to blame your kids for this, basically, which is amazing. And some of the best irony in the Old Testament is in this story. The rebels changed their mind, and they try to go and take the land anyway, even though the Lord told them they wouldn't be able to. So, like, they didn't want to, they were afraid, and then they get punished, and then they're like, now we're going to go do it. Like, just, I can't even imagine, like, what they were thinking, but I'm missing something there, I guess. This ultimately leads to another internal rebellion. You may have heard of Korah, less known, Dathan and Abiram. I'm not good with the language there. So God again wants to wipe out the Israelites. And this is the second time in the Old Testament God literally wants to wipe out the Israelites, and then Moses and Aaron in this case intervene on the Israelites' behalf and plead for him not to, which is, again, a rather fascinating way to think of that relationship. So again, God's wrath is limited to the main 250, and they were immediately swallowed up by the earth, just to make the point that this wasn't an accident. They didn't just disappear. They actually watched them be eaten up by the earth. So just amazing stuff. And of course, this is following, again, think of the things that they witnessed with the plagues, the parting of the seas more than once, free food and water in the desert, which doesn't just happen, right? The moving pillar of fire, the cloud. There's just so many things that the Israelites got to see. But even Moses, sadly enough, is not immune to disobedience. In chapter 21, he strikes the rock twice. You may remember that account. And he and Aaron are denied entrance into the promised land as well, although they are promised they will be allowed to see it before each one of them dies. Chapter 22 through 24, most of us are familiar with Balaam, his donkey, and the angel, but then there's all these oracles that he presents, just very interesting to read. As time passes, the Israelites approach the end of their long journey as they're heading into Moab, and they just fall head over heels for this people group. They intermarry. They eat their sacrificial foods. They bow down to their Baals. And, you know, like if you didn't get the nuances of the law, because back in chapter 15, by the way, a guy's out picking up wood on the Sabbath, and they stone him for doing that. So it's like, it's pretty serious, right? But this is like, it's the first one. The first command is like, you don't worship other gods, but they still did. And so then the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of these people, kill them all, expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So again, severe but limited, and maybe not as severe as we think. Just as the people were experiencing remorse for their defiance, we have that endearing account of Phineas, which Sean always wanted to name one of his kids Phineas because of this story. It's an interesting name. One of Aaron's grandsons, that was Phineas, drives a spear through an Israelite man and a Midianite woman, and the Lord is actually quite pleased with what he does because he was zealous for the Lord, and he was just tired of people not being zealous for the things that the Lord cares about. In chapter 28, underscoring God's affinity for the concept of authority, I missed Phineas, sorry. The Lord tells Moses that Joshua will eventually succeed him and gives Joshua some of his authority, and again, it's sort of like a replacement plan. And the parallel here between Wendell and Josh and Moses and Joshua it's striking. It hit me. Like, this is why this was recorded in the Old Testament for us.
Especially Moses' anger part.
I know, it's I don't know what you're going to be not able to see or enter before you die. I don't know. I haven't figured that part out, but yeah. Yeah, I was going to develop this whole joke about the 712-step plan of succession, and right now he's on step 6, which is, I think, the keys to the dumpster or something. I don't know. I'm like, I had too much work. So the Israelites don't seem to have quite enough to do, so they're given more things, daily offerings, Sabbath, monthly offerings, and the Passover. So again, the law and the regulations continue to grow over time. Additional feasts. This takes us through chapter 33. And it's very interesting because this gets into the final stages of the journey, and this is where basically that last little red leg, they are told to go what is basically the back door of Canaan. Like, okay, we're not going to go that way, we're going to wander some more, and you're going to go around that way. And of course, Canaan would include Jerusalem and what we tend to think of as Israel. But the plan sort of changes at the last minute because of that part in the middle where they failed. So and this is really fascinating, and sorry, I'm not there yet. In chapter 34, the book of Numbers closes with a lot of specific things about the boundary. And catch this, because I think it's fascinating. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the Israelites and say to them, when you enter Canaan, the land will be allotted to you as an inheritance," and then he explains all the boundaries. Well, I had this in mind where it's like, can you imagine like saying to your kids, when we get to the Grand Canyon, the first thing we're going to see is the South Rim. It's the best, right? You won't believe it till you see it in person. And then your kids are like, "Oh, that's great. When are we going?" You're like, "Oh, I didn't mean you. I meant your kids." Like, I'm just telling you that now. Like, it seems like, I don't know. It was just so disappointing. They didn't make it. Deuteronomy is also called second law, which is a little bit confusing at first because it seems like we've gotten this far. What else is there to say? But this is pretty much, the 40 years has passed. Moses is still in charge. He's still alive, and he is basically giving or retelling what he wants to impress on the Israelites. So this is actually serves a really important function for them. So in the first 4 chapters, we have what's called Moses' first speech. He goes over the Israelite history, and then in his second speech, he reviews the law and the covenant under Israel. Like, because again, these things have happened over time, and they're not necessarily all there to see everything happen. And so this is sort of, you might call it like I wouldn't call it their Bible, but a condensed account that he thought would be beneficial to summarize for them. And he closes this takes us all the way through chapter 30. We'll go real fast through this. But he closes in chapter 30 with something that I think is worth reading. He says, "Now what I'm commanding you today is," and think of everything that's happened as far as laws and regulations and everything that the Lord's commanded of them. "What I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven and get it and proclaim it to us so that we might obey it?" He had already communicated it to him. "Nor is it beyond the sea so that you have to ask, who's going to cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you may obey it." And of course, scripture memorization was a regular thing, and actually tying it on to them. "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction as a decision. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience with him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will be certainly destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess." So he makes this all very plain. So in chapter 31, Joshua is commissioned, and at the same time, God promptly predicts Israel's next rebellion. In chapter 34, Moses dies as foretold, not having entered the promised land, but able to see it on the top of a mountain. And this is the end, of course, not of only Deuteronomy, but the Pentateuch, which leads us into Joshua, which makes perfect sense since he is now their leader. And it's worth noting, Moses is not comparable to anybody in the Old Testament. Sometimes he is called a prophet par excellence. These amazing narratives, nobody else had that sort of connection with God, and he had obviously a special place. And there's a lot that we could learn from it. So the question then, of course, after going through all that, and hopefully you'll take advantage of this week to go through it and read it, what themes do you see running throughout the narratives? That's the question that I was supposed to address that we'll get to next week. So we have got narratives with law being inserted in between. Well, it seems to me, just to close up with what we probably already know, the inescapable part, even on just a cursory reading or even just listening to what I just said, if you've never even read it, you have 2 things that basically happen, okay? One is God loves his people, but he demands obedience from them. Obviously, he wouldn't do all of this stuff if he didn't love them and want, the rewards are clearly spelled out. The problem is the follow through, and he demands obedience. It is not one-sided. And then secondly, it is inescapable that he is consistently faithful, even when they are repeatedly faithless. I think the question is then, what more can we say? Because I'm pretty sure we're already familiar with this. What might you notice when you read? What will I present next week? I guess we'll see. But again, hopefully you take advantage of that so that what we go over next week will probably in the context of things make a little bit more sense. But again, with the text we're using, it has, I thought, some very, very good insights as far as what we can apply as Christians as valuable takeaways from the Old Testament.